The wine glasses clinked together in a harmonious toast, a melodic echo that filled the dining room. The soft glow of the chandelier illuminated the polished wooden table and the perfectly set plates. Everything in the Lanes home exuded an aura of perfection. Friends chatted around the table, their laughter blending with the subtle background music. And there I was, seated next to Adam, my husband of 7 years, smiling at his jokes and nodding politely to his colleagues. To the outside world, we were the embodiment of a power couple. Adam, a successful architect with sharp features and a sharper wit, and me, the supportive wife with an elegant demeanor. But behind my practiced smile, there was an ache, a growing emptiness that I had long stopped trying to fill. Adam's hand brushed mine as he reached for his glass. "To my beautiful wife," he said, raising a toast. The guests applauded warmly, and I felt their eyes on me. I smiled, careful to keep my expression natural. Inside, I felt a strange pang of hollowness. Did he really see me? Or was I just another piece of the life he was building? A perfectly framed photograph on his meticulously crafted wall? The night ended with the usual pleasantries, Adam bidding farewell to our guests while I tidied up the table. As I placed the last wine glass in the dishwasher, Adam appeared in the doorway, his tie already loosened. "By the way," he began, his tone casual, "Dad's moving in for a while." I blinked. "What? Your dad?" "Yeah," he said, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "After the divorce, he needs a place to stay, just until he gets back on his feet." This news shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Henry Lane, Adam's father, was a man I had always found enigmatic. He was charming in a way that seemed effortless, his deep voice and confident demeanor always commanding attention. He hadn't been around much since his second marriage, but his presence had always lingered like the scent of expensive cologne, intoxicating and lingering. "He'll be here tomorrow," Adam added before heading upstairs, leaving me in the kitchen with a sink full of soap suds and a mind swirling with questions. Henry arrived the next day, punctual as ever. I opened the door to find him standing there, a bouquet of white lilies in hand, his gray hair neatly combed back. "Jessica," he said with a smile that reached his piercing blue eyes, "still as radiant as ever." I laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Come in, Henry. It's good to see you." He stepped inside, the scent of his cologne, woodsy with a hint of spice, filling the air. He handed me the flowers. "A small token of appreciation for letting an old man intrude on your space." "Don't be silly," I said, feeling a slight warmth in my cheeks. "Your family." As he settled into the guest room, I couldn't help but notice how different he was from Adam. Where Adam was precise and methodical, Henry was relaxed, his movements fluid and deliberate. There was an ease about him, a confidence that seemed to come from a life well lived. That evening, while preparing dinner, Henry joined me in the kitchen. He offered to help, insisting on chopping vegetables with a precision that rivaled a professional chef's. "Do you cook often?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. "When you've lived alone as much as I have, you learn," he replied with a smirk. As he handed me a bowl of chopped onions, our hands brushed. The touch was fleeting, but it lingered in a way I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't inappropriate, just a simple, accidental contact. Yet, for a brief moment, the warmth of his hand against mine sent a ripple through me, like the first gust of wind before a storm. "Careful," he said, noticing my distraction. "Don't let me ruin your rhythm." I forced a laugh, brushing off the sensation. "You're not," I said quickly. "Just tired, I guess." That night, lying in bed next to Adam, I found myself unable to sleep. His breathing was steady, a rhythm I had grown accustomed to but no longer found comforting. My thoughts wandered to Henry, his confident stride, the way his voice carried through a room, the touch of his hand. I scolded myself silently. What was I doing? He was Adam's father, a guest in our home. But no matter how hard I tried to push the thoughts away, they clung to me, persistent and unrelenting. As I stared at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, a crack forming in the perfectly constructed facade of my life. The days began to blur into a steady rhythm after Henry's arrival. He settled into our home with surprising ease, his presence seamlessly woven into our daily lives. Adam barely seemed to notice, absorbed in his endless projects and late-night phone calls. I, on the other hand, noticed everything: the way Henry carried himself, the way his laughter filled the house in a way Adam's never did, the way he seemed genuinely interested in me. It started with small gestures, asking me about my day as we shared a morning coffee, complimenting the meals I prepared, even offering to help with errands. He had a way of making me feel seen, his piercing blue eyes holding my gaze just a second longer than necessary. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, Henry strolled in, a paperback novel in hand. "Do you ever get time to read, Jessica?" he asked, his voice casual but curious. I glanced at him, surprised by the question. "Not as much as I used to," I admitted. "Life gets in the way." "What did you love to read?" he pressed, settling into the armchair across from me. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were focused, waiting. "Everything," I replied with a small smile. "Novels, poetry, anything that made me feel something." I hesitated before adding, "But it's been years since I've opened a book for myself." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's a shame. A woman like you should always make time for beauty." The compliment, subtle as it was, left a faint warmth in my chest. It wasn't flirtatious, it was genuine, or at least it felt that way. Our conversations grew deeper from there. He asked about my dreams, the ones I had before I became Mrs. Lane. He wanted to know what music I loved, what places I wanted to see. It was intoxicating, this attention he gave me. Adam, for all his success, never asked me such things. I began to crave these moments with Henry, these quiet interludes where I felt understood. One evening, after a late dinner, I stepped out into the garden. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that hinted at an impending storm. The hydrangeas along the path swayed gently in the breeze, their colors muted in the dim light. I needed space, a moment to gather my thoughts. The weight of Henry's attention, however flattering, was beginning to feel dangerous. As I leaned against the garden bench, I heard the soft crunch of gravel behind me. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. His presence was unmistakable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. "Just needed some air," I replied without looking at him. He stepped closer, holding out an umbrella. "It's about to rain." I took it, our fingers brushing briefly. "Thank you." For a moment, we stood in silence, the distance between us shrinking with each passing second. The first raindrops began to fall, soft and hesitant, like a whispered warning. "Jessica," he said finally, his tone quieter, more serious. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. I turned to face him, the umbrella dangling uselessly at my side. His eyes searched mine, as though he could see every thought I tried to hide. I I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. It was the truth, as painful as it was to say out loud. The rain fell harder now, a steady rhythm that drowned out the sound of my heartbeat. Or maybe it just felt that way. Henry reached out, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle, almost reverent. "You deserve to be," he murmured. And then it happened. His lips met mine, tentative at first, as if giving me a chance to pull away. I didn't. For a fleeting moment, the world disappeared, leaving only the warmth of his touch and the storm that raged around us. But then reality crashed down, cold and unforgiving. I stepped back, breaking the connection. "I can't," I whispered, my voice trembling. Henry's expression softened, his hand dropping to his side. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have." "No," I interrupted, shaking my head. "It's not you. I need to go." Without waiting for his response, I turned and hurried back to the house, the umbrella forgotten on the bench. My heart pounded against my ribs as I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for support. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. That night, lying in bed next to Adam, I replayed the moment in my mind over and over. Guilt gnawed at me, sharp and relentless, but beneath the guilt was something else, something I didn't want to name, a flicker of life, of excitement. Henry had awakened something in me that I thought was long dead, something that scared me as much as it thrilled me. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, adjusting the lace strap of the black camisole that clung to my shoulders. It was a piece of lingerie I hadn't worn in years, hidden in the back of my wardrobe under a stack of cotton pajamas. I wasn't even sure why I had pulled it out that morning. Perhaps it was the way Henry's voice lingered in my head, soft yet commanding. "You deserve to be happy." I added a touch of lipstick, just enough to give my face some color, and tied my hair into a loose braid. For the first time in years, I felt like I was dressing for myself, and yet, deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. Henry was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sleeves rolled up, tools scattered on the counter. The faucet had been leaking, and Adam, as usual, was too busy to deal with it. Henry, with his easy confidence, had stepped in to help. "Good morning," he said, glancing up at me. His eyes flicked briefly to the lace strap peeking out from under my cardigan before meeting mine again. "Morning," I replied, my voice betraying none of the butterflies that his gaze stirred in me. "I'm almost done here," he said, tightening a wrench with a practiced hand. "Could use an extra pair of hands, though." I hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "What do you need?" He gestured toward the cabinet beneath the sink. "Hold this pipe steady while I fix the seal." I knelt beside him, the scent of his cologne enveloping me. It was intoxicating, woodsy, with a hint of spice, and far too close. My hands brushed against his as I reached for the pipe, and the sudden proximity sent a jolt through me. "Got it?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes," I managed, though my grip was far from steady. The moment passed quickly, but the charge in the air lingered. As I stood up, I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Later that day, as I was putting dishes away, I climbed onto a small step stool to reach the top shelf. My balance wavered, and before I could steady myself, the stool tipped. "Whoa! Careful!" Henry's arms were around me in an instant, strong and sure, pulling me against him before I could fall. His hands rested on my waist, holding me firmly, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I looked up, meeting his gaze. His blue eyes were steady, searching mine for something. I couldn't tell if it was concern or something more, but the weight of his stare left me breathless. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Yes," I said quickly, stepping out of his grasp. "Thank you," he nodded, stepping back as well. "Any time." The next day, Sarah came over for coffee. She was her usual sharp, observant self, her eyes scanning me as I poured her a cup. "You look different," she said, her tone teasing but curious. "Different how?" I asked, forcing a laugh. "I don't know," she said, narrowing her eyes. "There's something about you. Did you change your hair?" I shook my head. "No, nothing like that. Maybe I'm just tired. Things have been a bit monotonous lately." "Monotonous," she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound like you." I shrugged, keeping my tone light. "Even perfect lives need a little shake-up sometimes, right?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying me. "If there's something going on, you'd tell me, wouldn't you?" "Of course," I lied, offering her my brightest smile. That evening, after Sarah left, I found myself alone in the bedroom. The events of the past few days played over and over in my mind. The way Henry's hands felt on my waist, the way he looked at me. It was maddening. This constant pull toward him, this unspoken connection that neither of us dared to acknowledge aloud. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out an old leather journal. The pages were yellowed, the spine worn, but it felt familiar, comforting. I hadn't written in it in years, but tonight I needed an outlet. I began to write, pouring out everything I couldn't say aloud: the frustration of feeling invisible in my own home, the guilt of craving attention from someone who wasn't my husband, the way Henry's presence made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. When I finished, I closed the journal and tucked it away, as if hiding it could bury the emotions it held. But I knew it wouldn't. As I lay in bed that night, Adam's soft snores filling the room, I realized I was beginning to lose control. This thing with Henry, it was more than a passing fancy. It was a dependency, a craving that grew stronger with every glance, every touch, every moment we shared. I told myself I could stop, that I could put an end to it before it went too far. But even as I thought it, I knew it was a lie. The dining room buzzed with light chatter as the four of us gathered around the table. Adam, always the consummate host, pouring wine with practiced ease. Sarah, quick with her sharp humor, firing questions at Adam about his latest project. And Henry, seated across from me, his posture relaxed yet deliberate. I tried to focus on the conversation, but the air felt charged, as though the room itself held its breath. Henry's presence was palpable, an unspoken force that tugged at me even as I sat silently beside Adam. "Jessica," Henry's voice broke through the noise, smooth and commanding. "You've outdone yourself with this dinner." I looked up, startled to find his eyes locked on mine. "Oh, it's nothing," I said quickly, waving a hand. "Just an old recipe." "Don't be modest," he pressed, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Not everyone can make something so simple feel so extraordinary." The word lingered in the air like a held breath. My cheeks burned as Sarah's gaze flicked between us, her brow furrowed in curiosity. Adam, oblivious, chuckled as he reached for the breadbasket. "You're lucky, Dad," Adam said. "Jessica's been spoiling us both since you got here." Henry raised his glass, his smile deepening. "I know exactly how lucky I am." The rest of the dinner passed in a haze. Sarah's questions grew sharper, her tone laced with suspicion, but I deflected with practiced ease, steering the conversation back to safer topics. Still, I could feel the weight of Henry's gaze on me, even when I refused to meet it. After dessert, Adam and Sarah moved to the living room, their laughter echoing down the hall. I lingered in the dining room, collecting plates and silverware. Henry stayed behind, leaning casually against the doorway. "Let me help," he offered, stepping closer. "It's fine," I said, stacking plates with trembling hands. "Jessica," he said softly, his voice low enough that it felt like a secret. "You're shaking." I froze, the plates clinking lightly in my grip. "I'm fine," I lied, not daring to look at him. He reached out, his hand brushing mine, as he took the plates from me. "You don't have to do everything alone," he murmured, setting them gently on the counter. The room seemed smaller now, the air heavier. I turned to face him, my breath hitching as I met his gaze. His eyes were unguarded, searching mine with a depth that made my chest tighten. "I see you, Jessica," he said quietly, stepping closer. "I see how much you give to everyone around you. But who's giving back to you?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. My heart pounded in my ears as he reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "You deserve more," he continued, his voice a whisper now. "More than this." Before I could process his words, his hand slid to my cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin. And then, without hesitation, he leaned in. His lips met mine, soft yet insistent, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. It wasn't a question or a request, It was an answer to something I hadn't realized I'd been asking. But then reality crashed over me like a wave. I pulled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Henry, I began, my voice trembling. This, we can't. You deserve more than what you're settling for, he interrupted, his eyes blazing with intensity. Don't tell me you don't feel it too. I shook my head, stepping back until the counter pressed against my spine. I can't. I just can't. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slowly, his expression softening. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. Don't, I said quickly, cutting him off. Just don't. Grabbing the remaining plates, I fled the room, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped them. In the safety of my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. Adam's voice drifted up from downstairs, calm and unaware, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. What had I done? What had I allowed to happen? And yet, as I pressed my fingers to my lips, I realized they still tingled from his touch. The sound of Adam's suitcase wheels rolling across the floor echoed through the hallway. He was rushing, as usual, juggling his briefcase and phone, barely glancing in my direction. Call me if you need anything, he said over his shoulder, his voice brisk. I should be back by Friday evening. I nodded, standing near the doorway, hands clasped tightly together. Have a safe trip. With a quick wave, he was gone, leaving the house eerily quiet. I stood there for a moment, listening to the hum of the silence, before Henry appeared at the top of the stairs. His shirt was casually unbuttoned at the collar, and his presence filled the empty space Adam had left behind. Looks like it's just the two of us, he said, a playful lilt in his voice. The morning dragged by in an awkward stillness. I tried to busy myself with chores, but every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the distant murmur of Henry's voice as he spoke on the phone. By lunchtime, I couldn't stand the tension any longer. Henry found me in the kitchen, staring absently out the window as the kettle whistled on the stove. You need to get out of here, he said, leaning against the doorframe. I turned, startled. What do you mean? You've been pacing around this house like a caged bird, he said, crossing his arms. Why don't we go for a drive? Pick up some fresh produce for dinner? I hesitated, the rational part of my mind screaming at me to decline. But then there was that other part, the restless, curious part, that wanted nothing more than to escape. Okay, I said quietly. Let me grab my bag. The drive to the market felt oddly carefree. The radio played softly in the background as Henry cracked jokes, his charm disarming as ever. I found myself laughing, the sound foreign but welcome. When we arrived, the small outdoor market was bustling with life. The scent of fresh herbs and ripe fruit hung in the air, mingling with the warmth of the afternoon sun. Henry walked beside me, his hand brushing against mine occasionally as we moved through the crowded stalls. Each touch, no matter how brief, sent a shiver down my spine. Try this, he said at one point, holding out a slice of perfectly ripe peach. I leaned forward to take a bite, the sweetness exploding on my tongue. Delicious, I said, licking a stray drop of juice from my lip. Henry's gaze lingered on me a moment too long before he smiled. You have good taste. On the drive back, the mood shifted. The lightheartedness of the market gave way to a simmering tension. The space between us felt charged, every glance weighted with unspoken thoughts. As we passed a small roadside inn, Henry slowed the car. How about a coffee? He asked, his tone casual, but his eyes far from it. I knew what he was really asking. The sensible thing would have been to refuse, to put an end to this dangerous game. But instead, I nodded. Sure. The inn was quiet, tucked away from the main road, its cozy charm almost disarming. Henry parked the car and led me inside, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. The receptionist barely looked up as he asked for a room. I should have stopped him, should have said something, but the words caught in my throat. My heart pounded as we climbed the stairs, each step feeling like a point of no return. The room was small and unassuming, the kind of place meant for fleeting moments rather than lasting memories. Henry closed the door behind us, the lock clicking into place with an almost deafening finality. "Jessica," he said, stepping closer. His voice was soft, but there was an urgency in his eyes. "If you want me to stop, tell me now." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my hands trembling as they found his face. His lips met mine, and the dam broke. Hours later, as we drove home, the weight of what had just happened pressed down on me like a heavy cloak. The intimacy we had shared, the way his hands traced every curve of my body, the way he whispered my name like it was sacred, it was unlike anything I had experienced before. But with that exhilaration came a crushing guilt. I stared out the window, the passing landscape a blur, as the reality of my actions sank in. "What are you thinking?" Henry asked, glancing at me from the driver's seat. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I just, I feel like I've stepped into a world I don't recognize." He reached over, his hand covering mine. "You're not alone in this," he said firmly. "Whatever happens, we're in it together." His words should have comforted me, but instead they filled me with dread. I wasn't sure what this was or where it would lead, but one thing was certain. There was no turning back. The days blurred together in a haze of stolen moments and hushed conversations. Every morning brought a new excuse to cross paths with Henry. A quick trip to the grocery store, a walk around the neighborhood, even the pretense of helping him choose a new book from the local shop. Each encounter was a delicate dance, their normalcy barely disguising the fire simmering beneath the surface. Our routine began to feel like second nature. In the privacy of the car, or in the secluded corner of a cafe, we could let down our guard. His hand would brush mine as he passed me a coffee, or his knee would press against mine under the table, subtle but charged with meaning. "Do you think they suspect anything?" I asked one afternoon, my voice barely above a whisper. We were sitting in a quiet cafe on the edge of town, a place far enough from home to feel safe, but not so far as to raise suspicion. Henry leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but watchful. "No one's paying attention," he said, his tone reassuring. "You're overthinking." But even as he said it, I caught him glancing over his shoulder, scanning the room as though expecting to see a familiar face. It was a small comfort to know I wasn't the only one on edge. The cracks began to show on a rainy Thursday. Henry and I had ducked into the same cafe for a quick coffee, our conversation light but tinged with the intimacy of our secret. I laughed at one of his jokes, reaching across the table to wipe a stray coffee drip from his hand. It was a small gesture, innocent to anyone watching, but the warmth of his skin against mine sent a jolt through me. As I pulled my hand back, I glanced over his shoulder and froze. Sarah stood at the counter, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of us. My heart lurched, panic clawing at my chest as I forced myself to smile. "Jessica?" she called out, her voice a mix of surprise and curiosity. She approached the table, her sharp gaze darting between me and Henry. "What are you doing here?" "Lunch break," I lied quickly, my voice too bright. "I ran into Henry and decided to catch up." Sarah's lips curved into a polite smile, but her eyes told a different story. "How nice," she said, sliding into the empty chair beside me. "It's good to see you both. So close." Henry remained composed, greeting Sarah with his usual charm, but I could feel the tension in the air. Her presence turned every word into a tightrope, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she saw right through me. That evening, the weight of Sarah's suspicion lingered. I sat at the kitchen counter, aimlessly flipping through my journal, my thoughts scattered. Writing had become my refuge, the only place I could safely untangle the chaos of my emotions. Page after page held my deepest fears and desires, raw and unfiltered. I left the journal on the counter as I went to check on dinner, distracted by the bubbling pot on the stove. The sound of the front door opening barely registered, followed by Adam's voice calling out his arrival. "How was work?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder as he entered the kitchen. "Same as always," he replied, his eyes scanning the room before landing on the leather-bound journal lying open on the counter. My heart stopped as he reached for it. "What's this?" he asked casually, flipping through the pages. Panic surged through me. "Just notes," I said quickly, crossing the room to snatch it from his hands. "Recipes, shopping lists, nothing important." Adam raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but he let it go. "You've been acting distracted lately," he said, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Is everything okay?" "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer, before he nodded, turning back to his phone. But as he walked out of the room, I clutched the journal to my chest, my hands trembling. That night, as I lay in bed beside Adam, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was playing with fire, and the flames were closing in. Henry's presence had become a lifeline, pulling me out of the monotony of my life, but it was also a noose tightening around my neck. I stared at the ceiling, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. Sarah's suspicious gaze, Adam's curious question, the journal that held every incriminating thought. It was all too much. And yet, despite the guilt and the fear, I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. The thrill of it, the way Henry made me feel alive, it was a drug I wasn't ready to give up. The park was quiet that afternoon, its winding paths dappled with sunlight filtering through the trees. The air was cool, crisp with the promise of autumn. Henry and I walked side by side, the sound of our footsteps muted by the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I had suggested the walk, desperate for space to think, but his presence beside me was both a comfort and a distraction. We reached a secluded bench near the edge of a small pond. Ducks drifted lazily across the water, their serene movements a stark contrast to the storm brewing within me. I sat down, wrapping my arms around myself, as though the act could shield me from the weight of the conversation I knew we needed to have. Henry sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. He was silent for a moment, watching the water, before he finally spoke. "We can't keep doing this forever," he said, his voice low and steady. "You know that, don't you?" I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "I know." He turned toward me, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Then what do you want, Jessica?" "What do we do?" I hesitated, my mind racing. The answer seemed simple on the surface. Stop, walk away, return to the life I had before. But the thought of losing him, of letting go of the fire he had ignited in me, was unbearable. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't just walk away from Adam, from my life, but I can't seem to walk away from you either." Henry leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and let out a frustrated sigh. "I'm not asking you to make this easy," he said, "but I can't keep living in the shadows, sneaking around, pretending this is enough. It's not." I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and relentless. "What are you saying?" I asked, my stomach knotting with dread. He straightened, his blue eyes locking onto mine. "I'm saying we leave," he said firmly. "You and me. We start over somewhere else." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Henry, I can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "What's keeping you here? A husband who barely notices you? A life that's more about appearances than happiness? You deserve more than that." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice breaking. "It's my whole life. My marriage, my friends, everything I've built. If I leave, I lose all of it. And if you stay, you lose yourself, he countered, his tone softer now, but no less resolute. I turned away, staring at the rippling surface of the pond as the weight of his words settled over me. He was right. I had been losing pieces of myself for years. But leaving? It felt like an act of destruction I wasn't sure I had the strength to carry out. I need time, I said finally, my voice trembling. I need to think. Henry nodded slowly, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his frustration. I'll give you time, he said, but not forever. We sat in silence for a long moment, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Then, just as I opened my mouth to speak, Henry turned toward me, his expression unreadable. Before I could form a coherent thought, he leaned in, his hand cupping my face with a tenderness that made my breath catch. His lips met mine, and the world seemed to fall away. This kiss was different from the others, not tentative or hesitant, but resolute. It was a declaration, a promise, a plea. My hands found his shoulders, gripping them tightly as I surrendered to the moment. When we finally broke apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. You know how I feel about you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Don't make me wait too long. The walk back to the car was quiet, the weight of our conversation hanging heavy between us. I couldn't look at him, couldn't let myself think about the choice he had forced me to confront. As I sat in the passenger seat, watching the trees blur past the window, I felt as though I were standing on the edge of a precipice. One step forward, and there was no going back. And yet, a small, rebellious part of me whispered that maybe that was exactly what I wanted. The days following our conversation in the park were suffocating. Henry kept his distance, respecting my request for time, but his absence only heightened my anxiety. I found myself retreating further into my thoughts, my journal becoming the sole outlet for the turmoil I couldn't voice aloud. Each entry felt like a confession, a dangerous habit I couldn't abandon. One evening, as I prepared dinner, I left the journal on the counter, forgetting to tuck it away as I always did. The sound of the front door opening jolted me from my thoughts. Adam stepped into the kitchen, his usual air of distraction replaced by an unfamiliar intensity. "What's this?" he asked, picking up the journal before I could react. My heart raced as I hurried toward him, snatching it from his hands. "It's private," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Adam's eyes narrowed. "Since when do you keep secrets?" I forced a laugh, tucking the journal under my arm. "It's just notes, grocery lists, reminders, nothing exciting." But as I turned away, I felt his gaze linger, his silence heavy with suspicion. Over the next few days, I noticed a change in him. He was watching me more closely, his questions sharper, his presence more pronounced. I couldn't tell if it was genuine curiosity or something darker, but it unnerved me. One evening, he surprised me with an announcement. "I've invited everyone over for dinner this Friday," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes studying my reaction. "Dad, Sarah, John. It's been a while since we all sat down together." I nodded, forcing a smile. "That sounds nice." But dread settled in my chest. There was something in his voice, an edge that made me uneasy. Friday arrived too quickly. The house was immaculate, every detail meticulously prepared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. Henry arrived first, his usual charm tempered by a quiet tension that only I seemed to notice. As the others trickled in, the atmosphere grew heavier. Adam played the perfect host, pouring drinks and keeping the conversation flowing, but his eyes kept darting toward me and Henry, as though searching for a crack in the surface. "So, Jessica," Adam said suddenly, his tone light but calculated, "what have you been up to lately? You've seemed preoccupied." My stomach turned as all eyes fell on me. "Just the usual," I said, my voice carefully even. "Work, errands, nothing exciting." "Hmm," Adam said, leaning back in his chair. "Funny, I found your journal the other day. Thought I'd learn a little more about your usual. The room went silent. My hands clenched the edge of the table as I fought to keep my expression neutral. You read my journal? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. I didn't have to read much, he said, his gaze piercing. Just enough to see that you've been busy. Henry shifted in his seat, his calm facade slipping for the first time. Sarah glanced between us, her sharp eyes narrowing as realization dawned. Adam, I began, but he cut me off. Tell me, he said, his voice cold. How long has this been going on? The question hung in the air, a grenade waiting to detonate. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation felt like a cruel pretense. I sat at the dinner table, my heart pounding so loudly I feared the others could hear it. Adam, at the head of the table, had been unnervingly calm all evening. His polite smile and occasional laugh only added to the suffocating tension. Henry, seated across from me, avoided my gaze, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his unease. Sarah, sharp as ever, broke the silence. Jessica, you've been quiet tonight. Everything okay? I forced a smile, gripping my glass to steady my hands. Just tired, I said, my voice strained. Adam leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. Tired, he echoed, his tone light but his eyes cold. Perhaps you've had too much on your mind lately. I froze, the blood draining from my face. He reached into his pocket, pulling out my journal and placing it on the table. I thought it might be nice to share a little reading, he said, flipping it open. The room went silent. His touch sets my skin on fire, Adam began, his voice even but deadly. I hate how much I crave him, how alive he makes me feel. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Henry stiffened, his composure cracking. Adam, please, I said, my voice trembling. Please what? He snapped, slamming the journal shut. Stop? Pretend I didn't just read that my wife has been sneaking around with my father? The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I felt the room spinning, the weight of their stares pressing down on me. Henry cleared his throat, his voice calm but calculated. Adam, this isn't what it seems. Really? Adam shot back, his fury barely contained. Then explain it to me, Dad. What exactly am I misunderstanding here? Henry hesitated, then shifted in his seat. Jessica. She came to me. She was unhappy, vulnerable. I didn't want this, but she pursued me. The lie cut through me like a blade. That's not true, I shouted, my voice cracking. You're the one who… Jessica, Henry interrupted, his tone firm. Let's not make this worse than it already is. His words were a trap, subtle but clear. He was distancing himself, leaving me to bear the blame. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. You're a liar, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You manipulated me. You made me believe. You're delusional, Henry said, his voice rising now. You were desperate for attention, and you found someone to blame when things went too far. The room erupted in chaos. Sarah demanded answers, her voice cutting through the noise, while John sat frozen, his face pale. But all I could see was Adam, his expression unreadable as he watched me unravel. Adam, I said, my voice breaking. Please, you have to believe me. He stood slowly, the weight of his silence more crushing than any words. He glanced at Henry, then at me, his gaze lingering for a moment before he shook his head. I don't care who started it, he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. You both disgust me. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. As the door slammed shut behind him, I felt the last shred of my composure crumble. Tears streamed down my face as I sank back into my chair, the reality of what I had done crashing over me. Henry stood as well, His face hardened with a mix of guilt and defiance. "I think we're done here," he said coldly, before walking out himself. I was left alone, the echoes of their departure ringing in my ears. Sarah and John exchanged a glance, but neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The house felt impossibly quiet in the days that followed. Adam didn't return that night, or the next. His absence was a void I could feel in every corner of the home we had built together. I tried calling him once, but it rang until his voicemail picked up. I didn't try again. A week later, the papers arrived. The envelope sat on the counter like a silent accusation. I stared at it for what felt like hours before finally opening it. Divorce. The word seemed heavier on paper, its finality etched in ink. Henry was gone too. He left without a word, packing up and disappearing from the house as if he had never been there. Sarah confirmed later that he had moved out of state, his presence now reduced to whispers and unanswered questions. I didn't try to find him. There was nothing left to say. The world around me moved on, but I felt frozen, trapped in the wreckage of my choices. The friends I once leaned on grew distant, their polite smiles barely masking their judgment. Even Sarah, who had always been sharp-tongued but loyal, struggled to meet my eyes. "I don't know how to help you," she admitted one evening, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "But you need to figure out how to help yourself." Her words stayed with me, lingering like an ache I couldn't shake. One afternoon, I found myself in the kitchen, staring at the leather journal I had left forgotten on the counter. Its pages were filled with everything I had felt, everything I had done. It was both a comfort and a burden, a reminder of the passion and pain that had defined the last few months of my life. I flipped through the pages one last time, my eyes lingering on the words I had written in secret. He makes me feel alive. But at what cost? Tears blurred my vision as I closed the book. Without allowing myself time to hesitate, I walked to the fireplace, striking a match. The flames leapt to life, hungry and bright, and I dropped the journal into the fire. It burned quickly, the pages curling and blackening until nothing was left but ash. That evening, I packed a small suitcase. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. The house was a monument to the life I had destroyed, every room haunted by memories I couldn't bear to face. I left without looking back, stepping into the unknown, with nothing but the hope that somewhere, somehow, I could rebuild. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of freedom, not the intoxicating thrill Henry had given me, but something quieter, steadier. It was the freedom to start over, to be something more than the broken pieces of my mistakes. And so, I walked forward, leaving the ashes of my past behind me.